to freedom, the pursuit of happiness, blah, 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 the government has a corresponding duty. And this is what's important, because he says, which is the first bold in the middle of the page, which may secure to them the ends for which government was first erected. Government was put into place. Government was first erected, meaning we entered into this state of the social so that government could protect the population. Protect them from what? Protect them from themselves. It's sort of weird to say it like that, and I mean, the train of thought is there. It might be a little difficult to see it, but if I'm going too fast, just go back and watch it a little bit. Hopefully it'll trigger. But remember, we said in a pre-social state, it's survival of the fittest. The strongest survive. Life is brutish, short, blood red. It's chaos. It's winner takes all. That is, at a species level, unsustainable, because we'll kill each other off. We contract in. We're mental beings. We contract in based on sort of psychological egoism, self-preservation. We contract into the social. We do that precisely so that we can survive. And we give that duty, that obligation to protect, to the government. Right? So now the government is obligated with that. That's why they were first erected. And without which, ancient names and species forms are so far from being better, that they are worse, that they are much worse than the state of nature or pure anarchy. So, what in the world does all of that mean? There is a right, the people, right, the masses, have a right to, and we just jumped right in it, right? But this is, I didn't structure the text. This comes out of Weston himself, the author of this section of the edited work. We have a right, the people have a right to revolt when our governments do not fulfill their social contract. And there could be a much, much more in-depth sort of articulation of what that means. But one of the prima facie obligations that all governments, irrespective of where in the world that you live, has, is insofar as they attain the sovereign status, they are obligated to protect members of their population, which is precisely why, and I do genocide scholarship professionally, which is precisely why genocide is such a horrendous act, right? Genocide violates, on a number of levels, the social contract theory, right? Genocide, it's like the abuse of dad, right? Insofar as you have the title dad, you are bound to protect your family, right? If someone comes and tries to harm the family, dad's supposed to protect the family against the bad guys. There's nothing worse than the dad that comes home and abuses his family, because he's abusing not only the family, but he's misrepresenting the title, right? Insofar as you wear the title dad, you're supposed to fulfill that role. Insofar as you assume the title sovereign, then you have to fulfill the role of protecting the people. If you fail, this is what this is saying, if you fail to protect the people, you no longer have the right to that name, sovereign, and the people have a right to usurp your power, right? So, that's the clearest I can make that. It's a pretty opaque passage, which is precisely why I chose it, to make sense of it for those of you that are reading along in the text, and hopefully that makes more sense. So, quote, this comes out of Weston, and obviously this first bit was from Locke, and this is what Weston says: the state's failure to secure these rights gives rise to a right to responsible popular revolutions, right? Weston legitimizes that by, he doesn't directly appeal to Locke. This was me going into Locke to find where Weston was referencing. But Weston legitimizes that statement, that, quote, the state's failure to secure these rights gives rise to a right to responsible popular revolutions, right? So you have to think about it. Now we're getting deep, you know. We're like 40, 50 minutes into the lecture now. And already we're talking about the right of the people to revolt, right? So it's important to recognize that the people, conceptually speaking, have this right. And this right surfaces only and precisely at the moment when the government fails to meet its obligations as sovereign. In a different lecture, I could conceivably discuss what all those rights are, but I'll leave that discourse for others in the community. All right, last bit for this first section is the challenge to natural law theory, right? All right, so the challenges to natural law theory. Number one, many were concerned that a discussion on natural rights would lead to social upheaval, right? A lot of people were concerned that the discussion of natural rights would lead to social upheaval. It sounds, in a pejorative sense, just to be fair to the other side of the argument, it sounds in a pejorative sense that when I say that I have a right, individual evokes rights, knowing that insofar as I evoke rights, I immediately evoke a corresponding duty, which is an obligation. Then insofar as I evoke this right, I evoke an obligation. Insofar as I evoke an obligation, that obligation is attributed, is placed on some party, on some institution, right? That obligation is an obligation that must be, has to be assumed, insofar as I evoke rights. So what ends up happening, first point, the challenge to the natural law theory was like, listen, well, this becomes a condition for social unrest. It could be the case that it's not that the state has actually failed the population. The state is doing its best to protect the population, to educate the population, and so on. But there is a perception among members within the population that the state is failing. And then they evoke the right to revolution, they evoke the right to revolt against the sovereign, and then you have rioting in the streets, and you have carnage. Right? This is now this is a condition for debate. Right? This is for formalized debate. This is a good condition for debate. If we assume via natural law theory that there is an inalienable right within and among the masses to revolt against the sovereign, once the sovereign has failed to facilitate its obligations to those rights, then we have to recognize that that failure becomes key, right? That becomes key. This is I'm not going to go too deep because I got a little opaque. But if we're saying that the population, the masses, have a right, and we see that Weston legitimized his claim based on a passage in Locke, which I've given you a link to, and I just spent quite a bit of time explaining, then we have to recognize that this has to be a real failure. It can't be the perception of a failed state, because then all that you have is anarchy and mass carnage, and then the state has an obligation to protect the rest of the people by getting rid of the people who would undermine the power of the state. So it's not an easy discussion to have at all, conceptually, right? And I think this is where we can, especially for all of the contemporary revolts that have been going on throughout the globe, and everything I've ever done on my YouTube channel, from Jose Ortega y Gasset's Revolts of the Masses, which was my first series, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Nietzsche's Will to Power, now my Human Rights series, there's an obvious theme here. The balance, however, is a very delicate balance, because on the one hand, individuals, the masses, can evoke a right and claim that the state has failed and use that perception of failure to, quote-unquote, legitimize revolt. But if the state really hasn't failed, the state also has a right to its existence, and insofar as individuals are attempting to usurp the power of the state has an obligation to act accordingly. Difficult conceptual debate to have. If this wasn't an introductory lecture, I would investigate that concept more, but I think if what I just said made sense, then we're good, right? I just want